There are cases that shake a community. Then there are cases that shake an entire nation's faith in the institutions sworn to protect it. What happened in Pima County, Arizona, belongs in that second category. Not just because of the crime itself, not just because of the victim at the center of it all, but because of what happened after. Because of the silence where answers should have been, because of the confusion where clarity was desperately needed, because of the finger-pointing where leadership should have stood firm, and because of one name that keeps surfacing in conversations across law enforcement circles, across courtrooms, across the desks of journalists who have been following this case with growing alarm. That name is Nanos. And the question everyone is now asking, the question that this entire investigation hinges on, is devastatingly simple. Is he hiding the truth? Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome to Case File Records. We do not deal in rumors here. We do not traffic in gossip or unverified claims dressed up to look like facts. What we do is go deep. We go thorough. We follow the evidence, we track the documentation, and we bring you analysis that is grounded in what can actually be verified. If that is the kind of content you have been looking for, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Because what we are about to walk through together is one of the most deeply troubling investigative failures to surface in American law enforcement in a very long time. And this is only part one. The story begins in Pima County, Arizona. For those unfamiliar with the geography, Pima County sits in the southern part of the state, with Tucson as its county seat. It is a vast jurisdiction, spanning thousands of square miles, and the Pima County Sheriff's Department is responsible for law enforcement across much of that territory. At the head of that department is Sheriff Chris Nanos, a career law enforcement official who has served in various capacities within Pima County for decades. He is not a newcomer to controversy. He is not a stranger to public scrutiny. But nothing in his career has placed him under a microscope quite like the events surrounding this case. The victim at the center of this story is connected to the Guthrie family. The Guthrie name has become almost inseparable from this investigation, not because the family sought the spotlight, but because they have been thrust into the middle of a public firestorm that no family should ever have to endure. A family waiting for answers. A family watching the investigation that is supposed to bring them justice descend into what can only be described as an institutional meltdown. And through all of it, they have had to watch two powerful law enforcement agencies, the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, fail to speak with a single unified voice, fail to present a coherent, consistent narrative, fail to demonstrate even the most basic level of coordination that any serious investigation demands. What makes this case so difficult to process, what makes it so uniquely disturbing, is not just the nature of the crime. It is the fact that the very agencies tasked with solving it have become part of the story. They have become part of the problem. And the public, the Guthrie family included, has been left to watch it all unravel in real time. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to the moment when this case first entered the public consciousness. Back to when law enforcement first became involved and the early decisions were made that would shape everything that followed. From the outset, this was not a straightforward case. When reports of the disappearance first surfaced, local law enforcement was called in. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, operating under the authority of Sheriff Chris Nanos, became the initial responding agency. At that stage, the case appeared to be what it appeared to be. A missing person, a family in distress, a community shaken by the sudden, unexplained absence of someone connected to the Guthrie family. But then something changed. Something that elevated this case from a local missing persons matter into a federal investigation. Ransom notes appeared. And not just any ransom notes. These were documents that introduced an entirely new dimension to the case, shifting the legal landscape dramatically and triggering the involvement of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because when a kidnapping for ransom is alleged, when a ransom demand is made, jurisdiction expands. Federal statutes come into play. And suddenly, the Pima County Sheriff's Department was no longer the only agency at the table. The ransom demands that came to light were not traditional in the conventional sense. There were references to cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, a digital currency that, by its very design, is difficult to trace, difficult to recover, and nearly impossible to track without sophisticated federal-level tools and expertise. This was not someone leaving a handwritten note and asking for a briefcase of cash. This was a demand structured in a way that suggested, at minimum, a level of calculated thinking around the mechanisms of modern financial anonymity, and it was serious enough to bring the FBI formally into the picture. What emerged next was a joint task force, a collaborative investigative unit drawing resources from the Pima County Sheriff's Department on the local side and the FBI's Phoenix Field Office on the federal side. Task forces, when they function correctly, are among the most powerful investigative tools in law enforcement. They combine local knowledge and jurisdictional familiarity with federal resources, federal databases, federal analytical capabilities. When the chemistry is right, when leadership is clear, and when all parties are rowing in the same direction, task forces can solve cases that neither agency could crack alone. But that is precisely where this story begins to fracture, because the task force assembled to investigate this case did not function correctly. Almost from the beginning, there were signs that something was wrong, not with the evidence, not with the physical investigation on the ground, but with the command structure, with the question of who was actually in charge, with the question of who had final authority over what information was released, when it was released, and how it was communicated to the public and to the Guthrie family. The FBI pointed to the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office pointed to the FBI. And in the space between those two pointed fingers, in that gap of accountability where no one was willing to plant a flag and declare leadership, the investigation began to develop cracks that would eventually become visible to the entire country. This is where the name Chris Nanos becomes critical to understanding what went wrong. As the elected sheriff of Pima County, Nanos sits at the top of local law enforcement in the region. His department was first on scene. His department has jurisdictional authority over the area where this case originated. And yet, as the investigation evolved, as the joint task force formed, and the FBI's presence expanded, Nanos and his department appeared to recede. Publicly, there was ambiguity about the chain of command. Publicly, there was no clear, consistent message about who was driving this investigation. In law enforcement, that kind of ambiguity is not just frustrating, it is dangerous. It creates opportunities for information to flow in directions it should not flow. It creates environments where communication breaks down between agencies. It creates conditions where critical investigative decisions about evidence handling, decisions about public statements, decisions about how to manage sensitive developments in an active case are made without proper oversight. And it creates a vacuum that, as history consistently demonstrates, tends to get filled with leaks, speculation, and confusion. That is exactly what happened here. The moment that transformed this case from a serious but manageable investigation into something approaching a full-scale institutional crisis came from an unexpected direction. It came not from a courtroom revelation, not from a press conference, not from an official statement released by either the FBI or the Pima County Sheriff's Department. It came from a news report. A report from Reuters, one of the world's most prominent wire news services, published by reporters working out of the Washington, D.C. Bureau. The Reuters report made a claim that sent shockwaves through every community following this case. According to the report, sources within the FBI believed that the ransom notes in the Guthrie case were not genuine. The report suggested that those within the Bureau had concluded, or were leaning heavily toward the conclusion, that the notes were fabricated, that the ransom scenario was not real, that what appeared to be a kidnapping for ransom was something else entirely. For a moment, stop and consider what that means for the Guthrie family. Stop and consider what it means for a family that has been living in a nightmare, waiting for news, hoping for resolution, clinging to every official statement as a potential lifeline. And then imagine the news report hitting. Imagine reading or hearing that the very foundation of the investigation, the ransom notes, the evidence that transformed this into a federal case in the first place, might be fraudulent. Imagine the confusion, the devastation, the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing what to believe, not knowing whether the investigation is on the right track, not knowing whether the people supposed to be searching for truth are even looking in the right direction. And then imagine that less than 24 hours after that report was published, it was retracted. The retraction of the Reuters story may be the single most telling moment in this entire saga so far, because retractions do not happen without reason. Major news organizations with the stature and institutional credibility of Reuters do not publish stories and then walk them back within a day unless something has gone seriously, fundamentally wrong. Either the story was wrong from the beginning, which raises the question of why it was published at all, or the story was right, and someone with enough authority or enough pressure applied to the situation made it go away. Or the story was partially right, capturing a genuine internal disagreement within the FBI that certain parties were desperate to suppress once it became public. None of those three possibilities reflects well on anyone involved. If the story was inaccurate, it means Reuters published unverified information about one of the most sensitive, active investigations in the country, which represents a catastrophic failure of journalistic standards. If the story was accurate and was pressured into retraction, the implications are far darker and far more troubling. And if the story captured a real internal dispute, then the retraction becomes an attempt to paper over a fracture that the public absolutely has the right to know about, because that fracture is directly affecting the quality and direction of the investigation into a missing persons case. What the retraction tells us, regardless of which explanation is closest to the truth, is that the management of information in this investigation has been neither professional nor consistent. What it tells us is that someone, somewhere, made a decision to release information they had no authorization to release. And what it tells us is that neither the FBI nor the Pima County Sheriff's Department has been able to establish the kind of disciplined, unified communication strategy that a case of this magnitude demands. If you are still watching at this point, go ahead and drop a comment right now with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who is genuinely following this story from beginning to end. And if you have not already subscribed to Case File Records, now is the time, because we are just getting into the heart of this case, and you do not want to miss what comes next. The question that has consumed analysts, commentators, and investigative journalists since the Reuters retraction is a simple one. Where did the leak come from? Who inside the investigation made the decision, authorized or otherwise, to share with reporters the conclusion, or the alleged conclusion, of FBI analysts regarding the authenticity of the ransom notes? And why? In law enforcement, the management of information in an active investigation is not a minor administrative concern. It is a matter of investigative integrity. It is a matter of strategic necessity. Leaks in active investigations can tip off suspects. They can contaminate potential witnesses. They can compromise evidence chains. They can alert targets to the nature and direction of the investigative effort being mounted against them. And in a case that involves cryptocurrency, in a case where the financial trail is inherently fragile and time-sensitive, the damage a leak can do is not theoretical. It is immediate. It is measurable. And in some circumstances, it is irreversible. The leak in the Guthrie case did not come from a casual slip. This was specific information, technical information, information about the FBI's internal assessment of key evidence in an active federal investigation. That kind of information does not walk out of a field office on its own. Someone made a choice. Someone decided that the information should be in the hands of reporters. And whoever made that decision either had authorization from leadership, which would make this a deliberate strategic leak, or they did not, which would make this a serious breach of investigative protocol that should have immediate disciplinary consequences. From what has been publicly reported and discussed by analysts with direct law enforcement experience, the weight of available information suggests this was not an authorized release. It does not appear to have been a coordinated strategic communication from either agency. It appears to have been unauthorized. And if that is accurate, then the questions that follow are profound. Who leaked it? What was their motivation? And what, if anything, has been done about it? There is a theory that has circulated in investigative circles, advanced by commentators with access to sources in and around the legal community, that touches on the Bitcoin dimension of this case. Recall that the ransom demands allegedly made reference to a cryptocurrency wallet. In law enforcement terms, tracking a Bitcoin wallet is a highly specialized skill. It requires technical expertise and sophisticated tools. It requires careful execution because cryptocurrency transactions, while recorded on a public ledger in a certain sense, are designed in ways that make straightforward identification difficult. Getting it wrong, making an error in the process of attempting to trace or monitor a cryptocurrency wallet in the context of an active investigation can have serious consequences. The theory that emerged in the wake of the Reuters report and its subsequent retraction suggests that something may have gone wrong in the process of tracking the Bitcoin wallet referenced in the ransom demands. The suggestion, advanced by legal analysts who have spoken publicly about the case, is that an error occurred, that the error was significant enough to create a problem for the investigation, and that the leak to Reuters, the claim that the ransom notes were fake, may have been an attempt to manage the fallout from that error, an attempt to shift the narrative away from a potential investigative mistake. This is a theory. It has not been confirmed by either the FBI or the Pima County Sheriff's Department. It has been publicly characterized by law enforcement analysts as speculative, and it should be evaluated with the critical distance that characterizes responsible analysis of any unconfirmed claim. But it is worth noting because it provides a potential explanatory framework for an otherwise baffling sequence of events. If the notes are real, if the ransom scenario is genuine, and if an investigative error compromised the cryptocurrency tracking effort, then the incentive to quietly reframe the narrative to suggest the notes were never real in the first place becomes at least comprehensible, even if deeply troubling. What matters here is not the theory itself. What matters is the pattern it points to, a pattern of information management that appears reactive rather than strategic, a pattern of communication that appears designed to protect institutional interests rather than to serve the interests of justice, a pattern that, when viewed in its totality, raises serious and legitimate questions about whether the Guthrie family and the public more broadly are being given an accurate picture of what is happening in this investigation. The internal dynamics of the task force itself deserve careful examination. Task forces work when every member is committed to the same mission, operating under clear command authority, and willing to subordinate institutional interests to the shared goal of solving the case. The foundational principle is unity of purpose. Without it, task forces do not just underperform. They actively damage investigations because each agency begins protecting its own position rather than advancing the collective effort. There are credible indications, based on the public behavior of both agencies and the nature of the information that has leaked into public view, that the task force assembled for this investigation has struggled with exactly these dynamics. The public back and forth over who is in charge is not a minor bureaucratic dispute. It is a symptom of a deeper structural problem. When two agencies cannot agree on who holds authority over communications in an active case, they almost certainly cannot agree on who holds authority over the investigation itself. And when no one holds clear authority, decisions get made in silos. Evidence gets analyzed in parallel without proper coordination. Strategic decisions get made without full situational awareness, and the investigation suffers. The division appears to run along lines that reflect fundamentally different assessments of the case itself. Within the FBI, there are indications that analysts at the Behavioral Analysis Unit, the Specialized Profiling and Case Assessment Unit based at Quantico, Virginia, have developed a view of this case that diverges significantly from the working theory being pursued by the Phoenix Field Office on the ground. The Behavioral Analysis Unit works with patterns. They examine the behavior of subjects, the construction of evidence like ransom notes, the psychological profile implied by the totality of the available information. And reportedly, their assessment has leaned towards skepticism about the genuine nature of the ransom scenario. The Phoenix Field Office, meanwhile, has been working the case on the ground, conducting physical investigation, pursuing leads, managing the relationship with the Pima County Sheriff's Department and with the Guthrie family. And from what can be inferred from the public record, the Phoenix office has been operating on a different set of assumptions, two different theories, two different investigative directions, one task force, and no one powerful enough or willing enough to step in and resolve the contradiction. This is where Chris Nanos comes back into focus, because in a joint federal-local task force, the local sheriff does not disappear. The local sheriff does not simply hand the case over to federal authority and step aside. The local sheriff has a responsibility to his jurisdiction, to his community, to the family of the victim to remain engaged, informed, and accountable. Nanos's public communications throughout this period have been watched carefully by those following the case. And what many observers have noted is a consistent pattern of deflection, a consistent tendency to point toward the FBI when difficult questions arise, a consistent absence of the clear, direct accountability that the public and the Guthrie family deserve. That absence is significant. It is significant not just because of what it signals about leadership within this investigation. It is significant because of what it might explain about the broader dysfunction that has been on display. When the local sheriff is not asserting appropriate oversight over the task force, When the local sheriff is not demanding unified communication standards, not holding members of the task force accountable for unauthorized information releases, not forcing the kind of disciplined coordination that this investigation requires, the consequences flow naturally and predictably from that failure. The leaks, the contradictions, the agencies pointing in opposite directions. These things do not happen in a vacuum. They happen in an environment where leadership has failed to establish the standards and the accountability structures that prevent them. Whether that failure is a matter of capacity, or of political calculation, or of something else entirely, is a question that the available public record cannot definitively answer. But the question of whether Nanos is hiding something, whether his consistent deflection and his absence of clear public accountability reflects a deliberate choice to manage what the public knows rather than to pursue what the public deserves, is a question that grows more pressing with each passing week. The Guthrie family has been navigating all of this in real time. They have been receiving updates, or the absence of updates, from agencies that cannot agree on what the truth of their loved one's situation actually is. They have had to process a news report from one of the world's major wire services telling them that the ransom notes at the center of their loved one's case might be fake. And then they have had to process the retraction of that same report, which does not restore clarity. A retraction does not put the question back in the bottle. Once the doubt has been introduced, once the possibility has been publicly stated that the foundational evidence in the case might be fabricated, that doubt persists. It lingers in the minds of the family and in the minds of the public, regardless of what any retraction says. What the Guthrie family deserves is what any family in their position deserves. Honest, consistent, timely communication from the agencies conducting the investigation. A clear point of contact. A clear chain of command. A clear commitment to keeping them informed as developments occur. What they have received instead is a lesson in institutional dysfunction. A lesson in what happens when the pride of individual agencies, the protection of individual careers, and the management of institutional liability take precedence over the singular moral obligation that law enforcement carries in a case like this. That obligation is to find the truth. Whatever the truth turns out to be, let us be precise about what we know and what we do not know, because that precision matters in a case this consequential. What we know is that a joint task force was formed involving the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI's Phoenix Field Office to investigate the circumstances surrounding the Guthrie case. What we know is that ransom notes were part of the evidentiary landscape of this investigation, and that those notes demanded cryptocurrency in the form of Bitcoin. What we know is that Reuters published a report citing FBI sources who allegedly believed the notes to be fabricated. What we know is that report was retracted within 24 hours. What we know is that there has been a visible, public failure of coordination and unified communication between the agencies involved. What we know is that questions about who holds authority over this investigation have gone publicly unanswered. What we do not know with certainty is whether the ransom notes are authentic or fabricated. What we do not know is the precise circumstances of the Reuters leak. What we do not know is whether an error in the cryptocurrency tracking process occurred. And what we do not know is exactly what Chris Nanos knows, what he has communicated to his team, what he has communicated to the FBI, and what he has chosen not to communicate to the public. Those gaps are not inconsequential. They are not minor details in an otherwise clear picture. Those gaps are the center of this story. Those gaps are the space where the truth lives, if anyone is willing to let it out. The nature of investigative failures in high-profile cases follows patterns that experienced law enforcement analysts can identify almost instinctively. One of those patterns is the gap between what agencies say publicly and what is actually happening operationally. Another is the tendency of agencies under scrutiny to protect their institutional reputation at the expense of investigative transparency. Another is the way in which disagreements between analysts and field investigators, when left unresolved by strong leadership, metastasize into public contradictions that undermine public confidence and complicate the investigation itself. This case exhibits all of these patterns with uncomfortable clarity. The public face of the investigation has been inconsistent and contradictory. The internal disagreements between Quantico and the Phoenix Field Office have leaked into public view in ways that serve no legitimate investigative purpose. The question of leadership has gone unanswered for too long, and the family at the heart of all of it has been left to wait, to wonder, and to watch an investigation that appears, from the outside, to be consuming itself. None of this is to say that the investigators working this case are not dedicated professionals. Many of them almost certainly are. In any large organization, and both the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department are large organizations, there are hardworking, committed professionals who are doing everything in their power to advance the investigation and deliver justice. The failure here is not at the level of individual investigators grinding through the work every day. The failure is at the level of leadership. The failure is at the command level, where someone has the authority and the responsibility to step in, impose order, establish unified direction, and hold people accountable when they step out of line. That kind of leadership failure does not fix itself. It does not self-correct. It requires someone at the top to look at the situation, recognize what is happening, and make the difficult decisions that the moment demands. Whether that someone is willing to do that, and whether that someone is Chris Nanos, is the question this investigation has not yet answered. There is something particularly corrosive about the way this situation has played out from a public trust perspective. We live in a moment when confidence in institutions, including law enforcement institutions, is already fragile in many communities. When a case of this magnitude, a case that has drawn national attention, that has engaged the resources of federal law enforcement at the highest levels, descends into visible interagency dysfunction, the damage extends beyond this single investigation. It extends to every future case where cooperation between local and federal agencies will be necessary. It extends to every community that watches this unfold and draws conclusions about whether those agencies can be trusted to manage serious matters with the seriousness they deserve. The handling of this case has not been invisible. It has been covered by major news organizations. It has been dissected by analysts with direct law enforcement experience. It has been watched by legal professionals who understand both the investigative stakes and the institutional dynamics at play. And what many of them have said, publicly and on record, reflects a level of concern that goes beyond routine criticism. This is not about pointing fingers for the sake of it. This is about a genuine, documented failure of institutional coordination in the middle of an investigation that has real human consequences. The Guthrie family is real. The loss they have experienced is real. The confusion they are being forced to navigate in the middle of that loss is real. And the people responsible for creating that confusion through unauthorized leaks, through failure of command, through public contradictions that no unified task force should ever generate, those people owe more than a retracted news report and a few days of silence. Accountability in law enforcement is not a concept reserved for the subjects of investigations. It applies to the investigators themselves. It applies to the agencies they represent. And it applies to the elected officials, like sheriffs, who carry a direct mandate from the public to manage those agencies with competence, with integrity, and with the kind of transparent leadership that public trust requires. When someone within an active task force leaks sensitive investigative information to a national news outlet without authorization, that is not a minor policy violation. In the context of an active federal investigation, depending on the nature of the information and the circumstances of its disclosure, unauthorized releases of investigative information can carry serious professional and potentially legal consequences. The fact that such a leak occurred, that it made its way into publication by a major international news service, and that it was retracted within a day, suggests that whatever happened in that sequence of events, it was serious enough that someone felt the need to act quickly to limit the damage. Limiting damage is not the same as acknowledging wrongdoing. Retracting a story is not the same as taking responsibility for the conditions that made the leak possible in the first place. And issuing no public statement about the circumstances of the leak, which is precisely what has happened here, is not an acceptable response from agencies with the public accountability obligations that both the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department carry. The public does not need every operational detail of an active investigation. The public does not need to know the names of confidential informants or the precise technical parameters of digital forensic work being done on cryptocurrency wallets. But the public does have a legitimate right to know who is in charge. The public does have a legitimate right to know that the agencies working this case are coordinated, are communicating effectively, and are being held accountable when serious breaches of investigative protocol occur. Those are not operational details. Those are basic standards of institutional conduct. And this investigation has not met them. What comes next in this case is genuinely uncertain. There are active investigative threads being pursued, and it would be irresponsible to speculate about the specific direction of those threads or to characterize the likely outcome of the investigation. What can be said, based on the publicly documented record, is that the investigation faces real structural challenges that will have to be addressed if there is any hope of reaching a resolution that serves justice for the Guthrie family. The leadership question must be resolved. Someone has to be clearly in charge, not nominally in charge, not technically in charge on an organizational chart while operationally deferring to another agency. Actually in charge, directing the task force with clear authority, unified strategy, and the kind of disciplined information management that prevents unauthorized leaks from undermining the investigation. The authenticity question around the ransom notes must be resolved internally, with a definitive assessment that drives a unified investigative direction. If the FBI's Quantico analysts in the Phoenix field office have reached different conclusions about the nature of the notes, that disagreement has to be adjudicated by someone with the authority to make a final call. Letting that disagreement persist, letting it continue to generate divergent investigative directions, is not a sustainable situation for a case with the stakes this one carries. And the accountability question for the Reuters leak must be addressed, not quietly, not internally, in a way that never becomes public, but in a way that sends a clear message to every member of the task force that information about this investigation is not available for unauthorized sharing, that the investigative integrity of this case takes precedence over individual interests or institutional politics, and that the consequences of violating that standard are real and serious. Chris Nanos sits at the center of all of this, not by accident, but by virtue of his position. The Pima County Sheriff is not a passive participant in a federal investigation that happens to touch his jurisdiction. He is a principal agency head with both the authority and the responsibility to demand better from this task force than what it has produced so far. Whether he has exercised that authority behind closed doors is not something the public record can confirm. What the public record shows is that the visible, external behavior of the task force, the contradictions, the unauthorized leak, the leadership vacuum in public communications, has not reflected the kind of firm, unified direction that his position demands. That is the core of the question this documentary sets out to examine. Not whether Nanos is a good or bad person, not whether he is a competent or incompetent administrator in general terms, but whether in this specific case, at this specific moment, in an investigation of this specific gravity, he has been fully transparent with the public he serves, whether he has exercised the leadership his position requires, and whether the pattern of deflection and ambiguity that has characterized his public presence in this case reflects something more than a cautious approach to active investigative communications. Whether it reflects a choice to hide the truth. We are at the beginning of an answer. The evidence is incomplete. The investigation is ongoing. And there are dimensions of this case that the public has not yet been given access to, dimensions that may ultimately change the way this entire story is understood. That is why we will continue to follow it. That is why we will continue to apply the same standard to every piece of information that becomes available. Documented, verified, responsibly analyzed, and presented without the inflation or distortion that does a disservice to the real people at the center of this story. The Guthrie family deserves that. The public deserves that. And frankly, the truth deserves that. This is part one of our coverage of a story that is far from over. We have laid the foundation here. We have walked through the key documented facts: the task force formation, the ransom notes, the cryptocurrency demands, the Reuters report and its retraction, the internal FBI divisions, the leadership vacuum, the unauthorized leak, and the central question of what Chris Nanos knows and what he has chosen to share. In part two, we go deeper. We examine what has emerged since the retraction. We look more closely at the behavior of specific individuals within this investigation. And we begin to assess whether the pattern we have documented here points toward negligence, toward institutional self-protection, or towards something more deliberately concealed. If this case matters to you, if the question of accountability and law enforcement matters to you, then there is something you can do right now. Like this video. Subscribe to Case File Records if you have not already, because part two is coming and you do not want to come back to find you missed it. And leave a comment below telling us what part of this case concerns you most. Is it the ransom note controversy, the unauthorized leak, the leadership vacuum, the Nanos question, Tell us what you think, because this community is part of how we track these stories and ensure that cases like this one do not disappear into the silence that powerful institutions sometimes prefer. The Guthrie family is still waiting for answers. We are not going to stop asking the questions that might help get them there. This is Case File Records. We will see you in part 2.